What's fascinating about the nuclear context is that it introduces a kind of secular apocalypse. So normally the end of the world is imagined in terms of a judgment of God, and it might be kind of terrible, but there is some sort of apportioning of justice that takes place. What's striking in the nuclear age is the possibility of the end of the world as an accident. It kind of presents human life as absurd in some sense, as arbitrary, and how we generate meaning for our lives in the light of that.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. Today, I'm speaking with Daniel Cordle, an associate professor in English and American literature at Nottingham Trent University. He is an expert in literature and culture of the nuclear age, which is obviously why he's on this podcast. As happens quite frequently, I learn along with you. Daniel opened my eyes to the rich field of nuclear literature and expanded it way past science fiction. I asked him to recommend a book for me to read in preparation of our conversation, and he gave me a list. I settled on A Gift Upon the Shore by M.K. Wren, which was published in 1990. We discussed this book on the podcast. I won't give away any plot spoilers, but A Gift Upon the Shore tells the story of two women, Rachel and Mary, who survive nuclear war in the American Northwest and devote their lives to saving and preserving books so civilization can start anew. They eventually encounter other survivors from a religious group who offer community and family. But this group thinks nuclear war is the judgment of God, and the books the women save might be blasphemous. Rachel and Mary have to make difficult decisions about the extent to which they are willing to compromise their vision of the future. Before we begin, I want to mention a mistake I made. I gave the wrong name of the Dr. Seuss book about nuclear proliferation. The correct name is The Butter Battle Book, and you should all read it. I'm dropping you into a conversation Daniel and I are having about a piece he wrote about the war in Ukraine. I don't like doing it, but this is a conversation I think is important and brings context to the rest of the podcast. The piece, called Expert Blog Long After Midnight on our new nuclear fears, will be linked in the show notes on our website.
Do you know Robert J Lifton's work, a psychiatrist? He worked with survivors of Hiroshima, but he speculated about the psychological impacts of living in the Cold War nuclear age, and writing in the 70s and 80s, he talked about it as a shadow that intrudes upon our mental ecology. And I kind of quite like that image of the mind as an ecology, and sort of something that's kind of there in the background and moving through the systems of the mind, but not right in front of us.
That is interesting. I like that. And actually that plays into how do we deal with that mental intrusion as humans and as thoughtful, creative beings. And one way we deal with it is through writing. Yeah,
it's a way of giving shape to fears, isn't it? I mean, nuclear literature is a literature mostly of stuff that didn't happen and of stuff that may or may not happen in the future. Yeah, kind of culturally, obviously lots of stuff happened in the Cold War, didn't it? But it was defined by the stuff that wasn't happening. And I think that's a really interesting thing, that you've got this period of living before a moment of something kind of terrible, which of course is a kind of human experience anyway, isn't it? Mortality is there anyway, but perhaps there is something about the nature of the nuclear threat. I think Lifton again talked about nuclear war threatening our symbolic immortality, the sense that things go on after us, that we can't really kind of conceive of our own mortality really, but at least we have this sense that there's something that goes on beyond us. And of course it's very hard to imagine a world without someone to mourn the loss.
What some of this literature deals with, I guess, is not even someone to mourn the loss of us, but of our culture, of what we think makes us human.
Yeah, I listened to A Gift Upon the Shore again when you picked it up, and I've read it before, and I listened to it on audiobook. It's about the books, isn't it, really? That's what survives. Rachel and Mary don't have children, but they have the books, and the books are what survive. It's really quite brutal about what happens to Rachel, isn't it? What life without medical interventions is like, and what death without medical interventions is like. And I like the ambiguity at the end. I like it that Miriam's still there and that it's uncertain. I like all the stuff about the materiality of culture as well. It's not just the ideas in the books. It's not having paper. It's having to make your own ink.
Right. And I think you picked a good book for me. So I want to explain that I asked you to provide a book that I could listen to about nuclear literature. And you suggested A Gift Upon the Shore. And I will preface it with, I don't like science fiction. I know I'm a scientist. I'm supposed to like those things, but I do not. And I think this was a perfect book for you to give me because it was a nice story. It wasn't pretending to be something that it wasn't, i.e., it wasn't pretending to be an alternate universe where the laws of physics don't pertain to it. Although, if you were looking at it from a scientific lens, there were a lot of things that don't make sense, like, why are these the only people that survived? What happened to all the fallout? If you just get around those kind of questions. There was a lot of really interesting takes on that question, like what makes a civilization? What makes us human? What makes us a society that functions? What's our legacy going to be as people, as culture, as a society, which were very interesting that I hadn't thought about before in terms of nuclear literature.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. I can absolutely see why, as a scientist, actually, science fiction would be the last thing you would read. I can imagine a lot of it is really rather irritating.
It is.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of nuclear literature is really about society, really. I mean, a lot of it hasn't got, we won't tell you very much about nuclear war beyond the fact it wouldn't be very good and we really should avoid it. But that's not really a surprise to anyone. And there's not a lot of point in reading nuclear literature for that, I don't think. But it is obsessed with what our current society and culture is and where it's going and what survives and how we imagine cataclysms within that. And how we organise our lives together and the different ways in which we organise our lives together. And so I've got a huge reading list of other things on the same line that I could happily recommend to you, which are all about kind of different models of society. Because in A Gift Upon the Shore, we're presented with two different human societies, aren't we? So we get Rachel and Mary, on whom the novel focuses and through whom the story is told, who build their own little society of two. And then we get another society based at a place called the Ark, which has interpreted nuclear war as Armageddon. And these two societies need each other. And it's about how they cope with that. And of course, they've got very different perspectives on reality. One of them thinks that nuclear war is the judgment of God, and the others have a kind of secular view and want to make sense of the world through the memory of our civilization. And the story is about Mary and Rachel trying to preserve the books that they've got. And they can't even read them because they're preserving them in wax, because they're aware that the paper will deteriorate and they've got to preserve these things until people have the means to copy them. And so it's about the ideas buried in wax in the vaults that they build and an approach to the world which is more open, more questioning, and which ends, without really giving away the ending, which ends as a confrontation between two different types of reading. One, a kind of strict biblical interpretation of Old and New Testaments, and the other kind of encapsulated in the wonderful poetry of Emily Dickinson, who writes small, sparse little verses that are very enigmatic, very curious and intrigued by the world, but don't really give you any answers.
When was that book written?
A Gift Upon the Shore?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, sorry. I need to remind myself of the exact date, 1990. So it comes at the end of a decade of nuclear fear.
What's so interesting about that book, though, is that even though it was written in 1991, it could have been written today and have been just as powerful. It's kind of timeless. Yeah, it's a timeless book.
Yes. I mean, I think what happens in a lot of nuclear literature, so it's written in 1990, sorry, but it's so as the Cold War is just ending, depending on when you call the end of the Cold War. So it's probably started, I would imagine, earlier or imagined earlier in the 80s, when there's that fear and regrowth of nuclear fear in the early 1980s. But yeah, there is a timelessness to it. And I think a lot of nuclear literature is really interesting because it speaks beyond the specific moment in which it's written. So quite often it does respond to particular fears that people were talking about nuclear war a lot in the 1980s. There was lots of discussion about disarmament and about the threat of nuclear war. And what M.K. Wren has done with A Gift Upon the Shore is to really kind of take us out from that and to imagine what a world might be after any sort of cataclysm. In some ways, it feels more 2020s than it does 1990, I think, because there's a pandemic, there's a global financial collapse. It's all very, very kind of resonant, and we get nuclear war at the same time. I hadn't noticed the first time I read it. I think I kind of ignored the pandemic and the global financial collapse. But reading it again in 2022, those things are really quite striking.
Yes, it was that pandemic and global financial crisis, and then finally the nuclear war. It was like a tick, tick, like just waiting for the next shoe to drop, because I was reading it, of course, when the war in Ukraine had just started. And so it was like, oh, is this the third thing that happens? And then Gift Upon a Shore just comes true.
Let's hope not, yeah.
Yeah, let's hope not. A question I was going to ask you is, what do you mean by nuclear literature? Because you gave me a list of a bunch of books, and of course, some of them that I instantly recognized as nuclear literature, which would be The World Set Free by H.G. Wells, or kind of anything by H.G. Wells you can kind of imagine as nuclear literature, or anything that was very much about explaining the bomb or talking about the bomb. But A Gift Upon the Shore and a lot of other books you talk about, I guess I didn't really think about as nuclear literature.
Yeah, I think the thing that springs to mind, inevitably, when you say the phrase nuclear literature, is people imagine science fiction scenarios of nuclear war or of life after nuclear war. And although there are quite a lot of those, nuclear literature is a really kind of broad, rich field. And I mean, my definition of nuclear literature, I think, is anything really that pertains to the experience of living in the nuclear age. And that might include a range of genres, so novels, short stories, fictions of various kinds, but also non-fiction prose, so writing like John Hersey's Hiroshima, published in the New Yorker in 1946 originally, and subsequently in a book which is the experience of 6 people whom he interviews, rendered in a work of feature journalism for the New Yorker, and absolutely kind of astonishing in its approach to that experience at Hiroshima. And of course, he's a journalist, he's writing factually, but he's telling a story as well, and I think thinking about how he tells the story is interesting. So it includes those things, plays, poetry. I think it's worth as well thinking about what we might call kind of mainstream literature that isn't explicitly focused on nuclear literature, but where the experience of living in a nuclear age comes through in odd lines or paragraphs. There's an Ian McEwan novel. Ian McEwan's a British writer, and there's a novel of his, A Child in Time, in which the novel is kind of haunted, I think, by the whole context of the 1980s when it's written. And one of those things is the fear of nuclear war. So there's a confrontation imagined in the novel between, I think, a Russian sprinter and an American sprinter at the Olympics. And then this escalates. In the course of a few paragraphs, missile silos are having their doors opened and people are getting ready for nuclear war, and then the crisis dissipates again. So this just becomes part of this kind of sense of perpetual crisis, I suppose, is within the novel, and it records that for us. So nuclear literature is there as well. It might even be that we, in a nuclear age, we read some definitively non-nuclear texts in a kind of nuclear way. So the apocalyptic sort of scenario of the end of the world thing that N.K. Wren explores in a nuclear context, you might look back to Mary Shelley's The Last Man in the 19th century, which is clearly not about nuclear war, but is about thinking about kind of end times in various ways. They might resonate differently, maybe, in a nuclear age. So it's a really rich field. And I think what fascinates me about it is that it's trying to make sense of what's new and what isn't new, what's a kind of continuation from the pre-nuclear age into the nuclear age.
So have we always been fascinated with sort of the end of the world and what would happen when we were gone in literature?
Oh, I think we have, haven't we? And not, if you include religious texts,
well,
a lot of religious
of course,
traditions have visions of the end of the world. But of course, what's new, I think, and what's fascinating about the nuclear context is that it introduces a kind of secular apocalypse. So normally the end of the world is imagined in terms of a judgment of God, and it might be kind of terrible, but there is some sort of apportioning of justice that takes place. And I think what's striking in the nuclear age is that although there are some people, as in M.K. Wren's novel, who interpret the nuclear end of the world in religious terms, but it introduces the possibility of the end of the world as an accident. It kind of presents human life as absurd in some sense, as arbitrary. So it makes us think maybe about deep time, I think, in different ways, about the place of humans on the planet in terms of when our existence on the planet will end, and how we think about ourselves in the light of that, and how we generate meaning for our lives in the light of that.
Do people go crazy thinking about this stuff? I just never thought about it in the end of the world or the end of my life or the end of time in that way. Or at all, really.
Yeah, well, fair enough. And why would one? I think it's a very difficult thing to think about. I mean, I think that's where what I find valuable in nuclear literature is that it wrestles with human meaning and kind of making sense of ourselves in the lighter world of a universe that isn't predominantly human. So one of the themes that crops up really quite interestingly in a lot of nuclear texts is how you write about a world without people in it anymore. And of course, you can describe a planet emptied of people, but the fact that you're narrating a story implies a human judgment on that, or a human perspective on that. It implies a kind of mourning of that. And I think that comes across in a lot of significant nuclear fiction in terms of images of emptiness and abandonment. So there's a terrific Ray Bradbury short story, which is a science fiction short story that you really should read. I really recommend it. It's got lots of kind of crazy stuff in it, but it's a wonderful piece. So there's a terrific reading of it by Leonard Nimoy as well. It's a little kind of 11-minute story it takes to read. And it's written by Ray Bradbury, who's a kind of great of American Golden Age science fiction. And it imagines a suburban home, and we're introduced to this home, and it's very much in tune with all the visions of domestic technology of the mid-20th century. And it imagines this sort of taken to some futuristic development. And so the home is going about its business happily enough, ringing alarm bells, telling people to get up, making them breakfast. But there's no one left in the home. And in fact, there are no living human characters in the story at all. And the only trace is on the outside of the house, where the blast shadows from some imagined nuclear blast have kind of left their shadows outside. And the house continues until it ceases to continue. And I think what Bradbury's wrestling with there is how do we think about a world without humans in it? And so this house is haunted in some ways by these people who aren't there. I mean, the story's also, which I think is something that's worth saying about nuclear literature, I think also actually about anxieties and hopes for suburbia in the 1950s. It was an era of the great era of suburban house building in the States, and that kind of cliche, the American dream, maybe becomes embodied at that particular kind of moment. In its manifestation is in that idea of the suburban home. So it's stories about that as well as nuclear things. And then later in the decade, the British-Australian novelist Neville Shute wrote a novel On the Beach, which was turned into a Hollywood film. And that's stuffed full of images of empty cities. So I imagine this is another fiction that would be immensely irritating to a scientist, because it kind of imagines a cloud of radioactivity from a war in the Northern Hemisphere that sort of gets blown to the south. I imagine this is probably not quite a scientifically kind of valid model. But what Schute's interested in really isn't the mechanics of that.
See, that one's okay as well, because he doesn't focus on the mechanics in that part. He focuses more on the people. And so even though I haven't read the book, I've, discussed extensively the movie, and the movie is probably one of my all-time favorites.
Okay, interesting. Yeah,
it's fantastic.
Yeah, I remember my dad saw it live when it was first came out, and I remember him telling me that he sort of walked out the cinema and imagined he would walk into this city completely empty of people. And I think there's something about the images in the film and in the book as well, actually, of cities without people in. So it's a very clean apocalypse. There are very few corpses on the beach, and it imagines a war of neutron bombs, I think. So most cities are preserved, but everyone's dying, and it tells the story of people in Australia waiting for radioactive contamination that's going to kill them. And really strikingly, the novel starts, actually, you kind of know what it's about because you've read the back of the book, but as you open it, it's about people getting ready to go to town, and it's only a kind of few paragraphs in that you realise that, why aren't they driving the car? Oh, they've run out of fuel. Because why have they run out of fuel? Oh, there's been a nuclear war, right? So there's the kind of normality of everyday life shadowed by this nuclear future, which is imminent for them. And those city spaces become something different, because, a city really is, it's not the buildings, it's the people that live there. And so if you empty the city of people, then, suddenly these buildings become like kind of rock formations or sculpture, and they gesture towards the absence. And I think, of course, writers can't, coming back to to where I started with this, I suppose, writers can't really depict a world without humans in, or at least we can't think that world, because if we're thinking it, then we're imagining our human perception of it. And of course, you can only go so far with these things. You just kind of have to accept there's a limit to what you can do. But I think there's a real interest in nuclear literature is, well, where do we find meaning from? How do these people in Neville Shutes on the beach generate meaning in their lives? And of course, that story generates it in very conventional 1950s terms. I mean, there's a really kind of, in retrospect, generously a very dated subplot about this woman who's living a kind of happy single life, and then she falls in love with Dwight, who's an American submarine commander, and she's saved from her life of singledom by falling in love with Dwight, who remains faithful to his dead wife and children. But they have this sort of very chaste affair, and so it reflects the gender politics of the time. So it's about the future, but it tells you something about the time as well, I think. And of course, it's all very proper in Neville Shute. It's full of people at the end of the novel. They kind of shake hands and say, "Good luck, old chap," and nobody's screaming and raging at the end of the world. It's all
which I think would happen.
Yeah, I can imagine being pretty annoyed, I think.
Yeah, they're very British, or very Australian, I guess, at the end.
Dwight rocks up in his nuclear submarine, I think probably nuclear-powered rather than nuclear-armed submarine, and nobody blames him for, not that he deserves to be blamed, really, but everyone's sort of just very careful not to mention anything about the war to him. And I just think, here's this figure of world destruction, and nobody seems to really, it just seems a bit rude to mention it, which I find quite a striking thing about the book. But I do love the book. I mean, I think there's something that, particularly with those images of cities, is absolutely brilliant, even though it's very kind of corny and hackneyed in some ways.
That reminds me of, I had to travel back east during the very beginning of the pandemic. And we had to take a flight in Chicago at midday, and there was absolutely nobody there. And that's what it reminded me of. It reminded me of just this empty city. And then we drove back across the country on highways that were completely empty. And we were driving thinking it's like we're driving through an apocalypse, because nobody was on the street. No one was on the highway. The rest stops were completely empty. Like, we didn't see people for miles in the middle of the day. I felt like I was in one of those novels.
Yeah, I think that was one of the disturbing things, all sorts of disturbing things about the pandemic. One of them was just being confronted with that aloneness. And of course, what was the response to how do we manage the pandemic? A lot of it was about being isolated and separated out. And I think actually something that segues quite nicely to another concern in nuclear literature is another branch of the fiction is concerned with the shelter and the nuclear shelter and being alone.
Oh, yeah.
And whereas the kind of experience of wartime in the popular imagination of the Second World War, somewhere like Britain, for instance, is of people did have individual shelters, but of the communal shelter and of large movements of people as people went into industries that they hadn't worked in before, that people actually got access to the job market in ways they hadn't done before, and are kind of coming together. And a lot of the images at the end of a nuclear end of the world is of atomization, in terms of people being isolated from one another in their shelters, listening to the radio and waiting to kind of get their instructions about when it will be safe to come out.
So does that play out differently in British literature than in US literature? Because World War II was very different in Britain than it was in the US, as far as the Blitz and these common bomb shelters. It was just very different. So does the aftermath in literature look different?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that there's in British culture, there's a strangely, slightly disturbingly nostalgic strain in terms of talking about the sort of Second World War. And this is a kind of horrendous moment in world history. I mean, an utter cataclysm. I think the difference in British nuclear literature, maybe, is that we're closer to Europe geographically. We haven't got the vast space. It's harder to imagine surviving a nuclear war, I think, in the context of the Cold War in Europe generally, not just in Britain. I think in Britain, there's certainly a cynical strain. So one of the things, particularly in the 1980s, I think, where there's the revival of Cold War fears with the, kind of whole host of kind of historical reasons for that. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the increased defense spending in the States, the Star Wars defense system and cruise missiles in Europe as well, which generates a lot of controversy. But one of the telling kind of moments in Britain is a government civil defence campaign, which comes to light in, I think, 1979 or the 1980s at the latest, called Protect and Survive, where people discovered that the leaflet was going to be sent round in the event of nuclear war or in anticipation of nuclear war. And it was all about hiding under the stairs and painting your windows white and doing these sorts of things. And I think it read as comedy largely, and it just seemed utterly absurd. So you see Protect and Survive being lampooned quite a lot in nuclear literature. There's a graphic novel, When the Wind Blows, by Raymond Briggs, which is a story of an elderly couple who follow all the government advice, and he goes to the library and he gets his copy of, I don't think it mentions it as Protect and Survive in the book, but there's a film adaptation where it is Protect and Survive. And he thinks it's going to be a bit like the Second World War, interestingly, actually, given your question earlier. And he sort of looks back nostalgically, well, we knew where we were then. There was Uncle Joe and there was Winston Churchill and all these people. And gradually they become aware that no help is coming and that they're on their own. It's an utterly devastating piece of writing for children, partly, I think. And then it becomes a fiction that they can survive, that they maintain for each other, this couple. And then you're kind of just left at the end with what's happened to them. So perhaps there's a more sort of cynical strain. I mean, there are dramas where it imagines microclimates in mountain valleys in Wales where people survive. But yeah, I think mostly there's a kind of sense that it really would be the end.
And speaking of children, you mentioned there's a whole section of literature for explaining nuclear war to children?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the concerns from very early in the Cold War is, how do you explain this context to children? So I spent a while looking through the letters pages of the New York Times in the 1950s, and there's interesting sort of dialogue going on there about the psychological impact on children of living in the nuclear age and living with this possible kind of futurelessness. And that really explodes in the 1980s in a whole plethora of books for children and young adults, particularly for young adults and adolescents, about nuclear war. And some of them are about children who end up campaigning in one way or another for peace. It's a really striking one, actually a rather lovely book by a woman called Judith Vigner, who's an American writer, which is aimed, I think, probably at 6 or 7-year-olds, and is called Nobody Wants a Nuclear War. And it's a picture book. It's the story of this girl and her brother, and she's very worried about nuclear war, and they sort of run away. And their mum comes and finds them and sort of explains that, look, nobody really wants a nuclear war and people are doing what they can to prevent it. And here are the things that we can do. And we're going to write to our political representative, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's much better than I've made it sound, but...
Yeah, my parents did not read me that book.
No, sure. But, it comes clearly out of this sense of, well, we're living this life of, I mean, we always live a life of uncertain futures, I suppose, but there's a particular sort of future haunting us. And as we go about, again, this kind of sense of the absurd, I suppose, you kind of go about your everyday life assuming that you can make plans and have careers and relationships and other sorts of things. And then there's this other thing which doesn't feel real, but except at particular moments of, but what if, what if we throw this all away? But the ones for young adults are particularly interesting. And there are some really lovely books. There's one called Pride of the Peacock. And I'm struggling to think of the name of the writer, but which is about a girl who's terrified of nuclear war. And she's read Jonathan Shell's The Fate of the Earth, which was published in the New Yorker in the 1980s and also came out as a book, but which was about what nuclear war would mean. And it's a very deliberately speaking back to John Hersey's Hiroshima, actually. And this poor girl is traumatized by this and feels there's no future at all. And it's about her trying to find a way of living positively in this kind of context and finding a way of creating something, and the friendship she forms with someone who helps her find a kind of positive way forward. So there are those experiences. There are some really quite brutal books for children and young adults. There's a British writer, Louise Lawrence, who wrote a book, Children of the Dust, which...
Of course, the Brits come in with their...
Well,
with their brutal books.
I can think of some quite bleak US ones as well. But Children of the Dust starts with the girl coming home from school and the sirens sound, and she goes home. and she has to shelter with her stepmother and her brother, and there are these awful decisions about they can't let the family pet into the house, and this poor thing is left outside as the bombs drop, and it's really kind of quite brutal things. It is quite a traumatic story, but it's very beautifully told.
I'm traumatized.
Yeah, I mean, it is
the dog should never die.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, that's the rule of all children's kind of film and indeed adult sort of film and TV and books, is there a certain, you know that at least that the animals are going to survive, but not in this case, sadly. But it turns into a more hopeful story later on as it follows generations into the future.
Well, and I'm just reminded of the Better Butter book by Dr. Seuss is about nuclear.
Oh, is it? Oh, arms? This isn't on my list. It's surprising the number of people who do, whom you wouldn't think have engaged with this in one way or another. Alice Walker, she didn't write a novel about nuclear stuff, but wrote a lovely review. I can't remember what she was reviewing, but wrote very sort of passionately about the need to engage with nuclear issues in the 1980s. Grace Paley as well, an American short story writer, was actually involved quite a lot in activism in the 80s and was an organising force in the Women's Pentagon Action, which was a protest at the Pentagon in the early 80s. So yes, some big names engage with them.
I guess it just shows how important of an issue this has been for a very long time for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting looking back that we rightly remember the histories of protest in the 60s about civil rights and about Vietnam and the kind of cultural conflicts and social conflicts there. But of course, in the 80s, there was a huge anti-nuclear movement. I mean, of course, not everyone agreed with it, but it was very vigorously debated. So there was the Freeze movement in the States. There was the campaign for nuclear disarmament in Britain. There was the End campaign in Europe more broadly. And it brought lots of people onto the streets. I mean, this generates the atmosphere in which nuclear literature and film and TV and music and other cultural artifacts arise. And of course, they feed as well that debate. And in some ways, one of the things that's interesting about them is, given how politicized that subject was, is that not always, but very often I would say that their politics is actually quite ambiguous. I mean, I think they're probably, most of them are implicitly anti-nuclear, but in a rather vague way. And of course, saying how awful nuclear war is doesn't tell you how best to avoid it. And you could go in very different directions on that.
Right, because people who are for nuclear weapons say they want them to avoid nuclear war.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, very few people are actually for nuclear war, fortunately. So yeah, there's a kind of consciousness. I mean, there's definitely a kind of consciousness raising thing going on. And I think probably, on the whole, there's a lot of writers feel that if they're writing directly about these things, they're doing it to draw attention to an issue that they consider important. I mean, some of them use it flippantly as well. I mean, I think there are adventure narratives around nuclear war as well, because it provides a scenario for adventures.
Does that mean there was a large body of literature in the nuclear genre in the 80s?
Yes, definitely. I mean, in the 50s as well. So it does follow the kind of crises of the Cold War. So there's quite a lot in the 40s and particularly in the 1950s. And then after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, it's still there, but it drifts away a bit. And then there's an explosion of it in the late 70s and into the 80s, with apologies for that. Well, yeah, an unfortunate pun, let's say. But yeah, there's a lot in the 80s. And then it sort of peters out a little bit in the 90s. But I mean, it's still going on. The obvious things to think about are science fiction scenarios of the end of the world and so on. But of course, there's also the kind of nuclear thriller genres, the Tom Clancy's and those sorts of things, where there's a very different take on those things that are kind of interested in the technology and the organisation and, kind of particular visions of the Cold War as kind of vast systems of personnel and technologies and other things.
So are there parts or aspects of nuclear issues or nuclear areas that nuclear literature tends to avoid discussing, or is kind of nothing taboo?
That's an interesting question. What does it avoid? I think, as I've said, it struggles to conceptualize nuclear war, because our images of nuclear war come really from those images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's a different, terrible though they were, that's not the same as a worldwide thermonuclear war. It's before hydrogen bombs, it's before arms are held in a large scale. What does nuclear literature avoid? I don't think I wouldn't say there are things that are particularly taboo that I would have noticed. I'm sure it has blind spots. It may be that I'm blind to them as well. I mean, I think one of the things, actually, as a sort of literary critic, I suppose, one of the things that I think was a kind of blind spot that I'm becoming more aware of is that there's an engagement with not just nuclear arms in terms of nuclear war, but actually in terms of nuclear testing as well. So there are some interesting Pacific literatures in response to the export of nuclear testing into the Pacific by the States, by Britain, by France. So Kathy Jetnil-Kagina, I'd recommend, as a wonderful poet who writes about the legacies of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. Hone Tawar, who's a Maori New Zealand poet, wrote a wonderful poem, No Ordinary Sun, which doesn't mention nuclear testing at all, but imagines a sun kind of rising in the Pacific and doing terrible things to a tree, and I think is almost certainly about nuclear testing in the Pacific. Chantal Spitz's Island of Shattered Dreams is about French nuclear testing arriving in Tahiti and the social and consequences there, as well as the kind of environmental consequences. It's easy to forget that there are a lot of, although nuclear war doesn't happen after 1945, there are an awful lot of nuclear explosions, and there are kind of consequences to those. In the States, Terry Tempest Williams has written very movingly about being downwind of the Nevada tests in a book called Refuge from 1991, which is a memoir. So it's another example of nuclear literature that's not fiction, not science fiction, but it's about the experience of breast cancer in her family. It's also a wonderful piece of nature writing. It's about her work at the Bear River Migratory Bird Reserve. And then there's this excoriating essay at the end called The Clan of One-Breasted Women, which reveals what she thinks, at least, is a nuclear context for the illnesses that the women in her family suffer. And they're one-breasted women because of mastectomies.
Do you think that perhaps with the technology, the way that it has evolved, that it now allows the ability for people with these different voices to come into this space?
Do you mean that there are fewer kind of gatekeepers to the literature?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, quite possibly. I couldn't say definitively whether that's the case, but one suspects so. I mean, Hone Tawar's published through the ordinary kind of channels. He kind of got accepted as a poet. Kathy Jetnil-Kagina is a very fine poet, but she specialises actually in video poems. And so, she works with filmmakers.
Yeah, the reason I know her is because I follow her Twitter. And yeah, she has fantastic video poems. So her particular, I was thinking about that media allows her to express herself in a way that wouldn't have been possible 15 or 20 years ago.
Yes, I think so, definitely. And to get it out there, that's the other thing.
Right. There isn't someone stopping her from expressing this kind of unpopular opinion from the U.S. government, for example, or that needs this financial backing to get her work out.
I don't know the details of her. I mean, she's certainly at a point now where she's publishing volumes of poetry.
Oh, yeah.
And she's read her poetry at the UN, I think. But her video poem Anointed is a terrific example, I think, which captures so many fascinating elements of what's happening in nuclear literature. So Anointed is about an island, and it's based at, or one of the central images is of, I think it's Runis Island, where there's a concrete cap on the radioactive waste from nuclear testing. And she talks about the island as it was and its kind of fertility. And there's these kind of wonderful images of this sort of fecund island and all the fruit and things growing. And then talks about the nuclear tests that took place there. And then you get this kind of sterile environment that emerges. In the video of the poem, there's this really striking shot at the end where she's stood and you see her bare feet on this concrete dome. You've got this kind of confrontation between kind of flesh and this kind of material legacy of the testing. And the camera pulls away and you get this tiny figure on this enormous kind of concrete cap on the island. But the poem also draws on mythology about Letao, who's this sort of trickster figure who's sets fire to the village by mistake. And so this folk story becomes a way of thinking about what's been set fire to on the island. And the poem's called Anointed because the question it ends with, who anointed you with the power to do this thing? So in some ways, it's another version of Western culture of the Promethean myth of stealing fire from the gods. Something I think that's really striking in a lot of nuclear literature is that there is a sense of mythology in a broad sense, that there's a kind of strong sense that one way of making sense of this is through very old stories.
I can see that, yeah. Because it's such a powerful image, the bomb and the cloud and just the explosion itself.
Yeah, what do we associate with images of bright lights and revelations of immense power? It's the appearance of God, isn't it? So it immediately conjures up those images, and it seems incomprehensible. I mean, I think this is the thing. It seems beyond, we kind of know how these things work, and we know how the energy is released, and we know it's because of when you convert matter to energy, you get this extraordinary kind of amount of energy bound up in there that's released. But knowing all that, it still evokes these deeper stories. And I think the nuclear age introduces new things, but they're understood through lenses that, to an extent at least, that predate the nuclear age by a very long way. It feels, clearly it isn't supernatural, but it feels supernatural in some ways. It feels like an encounter with something. There's something perhaps as well about nuclear phenomena, particularly things like radioactivity, which, because you can't see it, because you can't smell it, because you can't hear it, it feels like a kind of haunting, I think, in some ways. So I think those are the sorts of stories that gets pushed into those sort of narrative structures in various ways.
So you're right. From the very beginning with the plowshares and Oppenheimer's quote, I mean, it's always been associated with ancient poetry or myths or biblical references.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, Oppenheimer, of course, is notoriously says after the Trinity tests that the phrase that went through his mind was the one from the Bhagavad Gita, now become death, the destroyer of worlds. And of course, lots of people have talked about that and about what was meant there. And I think it's probably more than a kind of simple expression of hubris, which is how it's sometimes seen. There are more complex things there. And the historian Alex Wallerstein has written very interestingly about this in his blog about the story of the Bhagavad Gita, which is about the prince being confronted with his duty to do battle, even though it's against his family, in effect. But yeah, there's this kind of religious text which becomes attached to that. And in nuclear literature, so Oppenheimer is represented a lot in nuclear literature. And there's lots of... and there's tons of nuclear literature about the Manhattan Project more broadly, but Los Alamos in particular. This is the thing that I'm really interested in at the moment in my current project. And Oppenheimer becomes this sort of, in the literature, becomes this sort of Shakespearean tragic figure undone by his sort of fatal flaw. And a lot of it makes reference to the wonderful intellectual adventure of nuclear physics in the first half of the 20th century, of these revelations about what matter is, and this thing that seems that this is just kind of just an astonishing human achievement, and then of course goes into working to build the bomb. And so the moment of the Trinity test, of course, features a lot in fictions about Los Alamos, where you get this first confrontation with the material experience of the nuclear explosion and the light and the cloud. And quite a lot of this literature talks about the kind of cloud dissipating into the weather and going around the sort of dissipating into the broader climatic system. So you've got this sense of something that is going to have broader effects. And a lot of it prefigures actually sort of reports that sort of emerged later in that summer of customers of the Kodak film company complained about their film being exposed. Not domestic customers, I think it was kind of X-ray plates and things like that, or medical film. So there were reports in the New York Times again about this, about an investigation that was kind of launched, and they discovered in 1946, they reported back and said, well, actually this was fallout from the Trinity test that had worked its way into paper mills that were used to store the straw boards where the film was stored, and that this had therefore kind of exposed the film. That incident crops up in one or two texts in Dexter Masters' novel, The Accident, for instance. The characters are sitting reading the New York Times and reading about that. But there is just this broad sense of this moment where the bomb project is suddenly, it's still secret at that point, but it's very swiftly, it's not going to be secret. And of course, it prefigures Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's a moment that a lot of narratives really fixate on, and even narratives that are kind of one type of literature, I think, kind of get frozen by this. So there are thrillers. Joseph Cannon's novel Los Alamos is a really great thriller, but also very good, I think, on the transition to the nuclear age. And it's a story of someone who goes to Los Alamos because there's been a murder, and he thinks it's going to be in a kind of escape from the things he's worried about in the Second World War. And it turns out that this murder is part of an espionage plot to leak atomic secrets.
Okay, that sounds like something I'd like, because I love murder mysteries.
It's terrific. But Trinity is this really freezing moment. There's a terrific description of being confronted with the horror of this moment, that what the character glimpses in Trinity, I think, is annihilation with a capital A, this thing that seems to be beyond all the stories that we have to make sense of it, this isn't just a bigger weapon, this is something of a different level. It's a very moving book, actually. I mean, it's very, the character also confronts European scientists who are dealing with news from home about the Holocaust, and there is no escape. I think this is the thing. Los Alamos feels like it's a place to escape to for this character, and he realizes that actually it's not remote, it's plugged into those industrial military networks.
How does the hydrogen bomb play in? Because I know there's a lot of work and a lot of talk around Los Alamos and Trinity because that's the first, right? But to me, I can wrap my head around a lot of stuff that goes on at Los Alamos and Oppenheimer and Trinity and the science and why people do things. It's the hydrogen bomb and Teller that I think, to me, make a lot less sense. That's much harder for me to think through. So how much work has been done with people kind of grappling with that subject?
I don't think there's the same range of, in fact, I can't think of any. This might be partly my ignorance and because I've not worked on it, but I just don't think there is the same range of fictions about the creation of the hydrogen bomb. It's prefigured in a lot of the Los Alamos ones because Teller's pushing for what he calls the super, isn't he, quite early on? And there are those sorts of discussions take place in a lot of the fictions around Los Alamos. So you get that conflict between Teller and Oppenheimer. They're sort of setting up that. And I guess some of those stories about Oppenheimer as well end with, some of them end with Trinity, but some of them end with Oppenheimer having his security clearance revoked. And that's partly because of his resistance to the development of the hydrogen bomb. So it sort of features there. I mean, it introduces something new in that this is a different level of destruction, doesn't it?
Also, not just with Los Alamos being kind of, there's definite historical context to kind of pin it to, but this narrative from history that somehow Los Alamos, quote, won the war.
Do you mean, is that the story that they tell, that Los Alamos wins the war?
Right. Because why Los Alamos and not Hanford, for example?
Because they make the bomb at Los Alamos, and because it's kind of a couple of 100 miles away that they test it. Again, events, I think. It's harder to tell a story of the story that, I forget your guest who talked about Hanford, but told that absolutely gripping story about the Hanford facility and the stories there and the kind of extraordinary industrial enterprise.
But again, it's the engineer, right? It's not the scientist. It's not as sexy of a story.
And I think it feeds into, so this is another blind spot, I guess, is that although most of the Los Alamos stories kind of acknowledge, of course, there is the Manhattan Project and always in particular ways, it feels like it's an easier story to tell of a few, I know it wasn't a few, but a few scientists in a remote place coming up with something. There's that stereotype about science, isn't there? It can kind of feed into that idea of the kind of lone genius, even though it's clearly not a lone genius. It's a product of organization.
I think it's also really easy to romanticize Los Alamos.
Oh, hugely, yes. And it's really problematic because it becomes a story about the personal dilemmas of these people who create this thing. And it doesn't become the story of what happens when it's used in quite the same way. It's this remote mountain retreat. There's something utopian about it.
Yeah, you called it a retreat.
Yeah, and that was unconscious, but yeah, absolutely that. And it was referred to, wasn't it, as Shangri-La, partly, semi-ironically, I think, quite often referred to as Shangri-La by the people who lived there because there was the mud and the lack of electricity and the dodgy water supplies.
It sounded horrific, except you were with these brilliant people that you could talk to. I mean, that was pretty much the only fantastic thing.
Yes, I think it is romanticized, and it's always a problem when things are romanticized. I mean, there are ways that story kind of helps you. I mean, perhaps it helps us think about the beginning of the kind of how we became nuclear story in ways that are rather limited. But I suppose it elevates it to a kind of, again, to a mythic kind of level, doesn't it? It becomes this sort of story of going to a wilderness place, creating something, finding something, and then the consequences that follow from it. It fits more easily into those ways of making sense of the world that we've kind of inherited culturally.
Yeah, and it is a very compact story, right? It's a very tidy one.
Yeah, and you can tie moments in. So there are moments that you can use for dramatic effect. So the death of Roosevelt becomes a kind of moment that crops up in a lot of these narratives where there's a sudden doubt about the direction of things. Roosevelt had felt familiar. He'd been with the country through the Depression and through the war, and suddenly you've got this new man, Truman, in. And of course, Germany is defeated in the same spring. So the original reason for building the bomb shifts, and so you've got this kind of story that you can tell. You can tell a lot of things through how people react to Roosevelt, or at least you can tell the story in that way. Some of the very best Los Alamos literature is self-conscious about those mythologizing processes and engage with it. So Louisa Hall's novel Trinity, which is about Oppenheimer, doesn't tell the story through the first person of Oppenheimer or focusing directly on Oppenheimer, but through a series of figures whose life he touches glancingly. So there's an FBI agent who is trailing him in San Francisco. There's a secretary who's working with him ahead of the security clearance hearings. So the story kind of uses this perspective to sort of think about how stories are told about him. So it becomes a story of Oppenheimer, but actually of how stories of Oppenheimer are told at the same time.
I think I might like that book.
The story of Los Alamos is also more than the story of the people involved, more than the scientists, more even than the engineers and the military personnel. Tarache Nesbitt's written about the women who came to Los Alamos, but also outside the security fence as well. So Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony, which is a kind of central text of the Native American canon of literature, is all about, it's not explicitly about the Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project, but it's absolutely central to it that it's set in New Mexico and that you've got this thing taking place that's affecting the Teo, who's a protagonist who's a veteran of the Bataan Death March, comes back traumatized and is trying to come to terms with the violence of war and the kind of causes and continuities and break out of a cycle of violence himself. So that, that's another nuclear story, I think, even though the Trinity test is mentioned because someone who's got impaired sight kind of sees the flash and a uranium mine is mentioned. And, there's a kind of nuclear geography to New Mexico that's invoked in the story. But also Rudolf Anaya's Bless Me Ultima Hispano text suddenly has a chapter which is about Los Alamos. And then you've got other apocalyptic visions in this story, which is about something else entirely, but it's contextualized through that nuclear context. So there are lots of different stories that can be told beyond Oppenheimer.
Is this a genre that people are still writing in?
Yes, indeed. Yes. People are continuing to write nuclear novels, and the nuclear age has shaped as well literature that's not explicitly nuclear. So Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is kind of defining apocalyptic text of the 21st century, has images of flashes and burnt cities which aren't named as nuclear, but I think clearly sort of take their imagery from that experience. And I think as well as an interest in deep time and nuclear waste and, the things that we build to store nuclear waste, and not so much for whether they keep it safe or not and the logistics of looking after this stuff, but because it's an architecture that's got to last a very long time. And the pyramids are 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and this is an architecture that's got to last beyond that. So, what will I suppose it's a literature that asks, or a culture that asks, what will our architectural legacies be? How can we imagine what it means to be human in 500 years or 5,000 years or 50,000 years? How will people still understand what we understand by this stuff and what to do with it or what not to do with it?
Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you to Daniel for his time. There is a list of books mentioned on this podcast on our website. If you would like to hear us discuss more about Oppenheimer or Los Alamos, head on over to mynuclearlife.com to find out about how to sign up for bonus content. If you would like to send us comments or questions, use mynuclearlife@protonmail.com. To help other nuclear geeks find us, leave a rating or a review on iTunes. Until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.